Hi, my name's Phil. I like to come out politics, and today, just over 5 years since we left the EU, we have a bit of a historic occasion. We're on to our fourth Prime Minister since shooting ourselves in the foot, but this is the first time one of them has met formally with the EU Council. There's also a determination by Keir Starmer that this summer we will know the agreements that we're going to be working on together over the next few years, because he wants some material benefits to show for our closer cooperation before the next election. Something which will be vital in persuading the smudging of at least some of those bothersome current red lines. So what's on the table? What are we likely to see agreed in principle this year and implemented before the end of this Parliament? But first, for daily political commentary, please hit the subscribe button to stay notified. So although today marks the first day of formal talks, it's worth pointing out there have been obviously informal discussions going on for a while. But as we've seen, we've wasted a bit of time with both the UK and the EU not quite understanding what the other wants. So formal talks beginning, we can now hopefully make more rapid progress. Starmer is keen to get a framework sorted out for this summer. In theory, of course, this risks the same trap Boris Johnson fell into, signalling to the other side that you are desperate and time is precious. But, on the other hand, Starmer's time frame is entirely dictated by himself, and the areas being discussed are mostly of mutual benefit anyway. So what are some of these areas? Well, the main topic of discussion today is security and defence. Now, part of this is acknowledging that Europe needs to face up to the fact that Trump is keen on us shouldering more of the burden of our own defence, which is one of the few reasonable things he tends to talk about. The aim is apparently to get defence officials meeting with their EU counterparts several times a year for talks. This is what we've been missing, actual discussions taking place between British and other European officials. Starmer apparently has proposals for the EU Council on defence and security today. We'll have to find out what those are later. But the dinner afterwards will be where he wants to sound some leaders out on broader plans. He wants to arrange a summit for this spring to pin down the agreements we should both be working on. Now, there will be weekly meetings at some point soon between Labour's Nick Thomas-Symonds, who is our de facto EU minister, and the EU Commission's Maroš Šefčovič, who probably can't believe he's still having to do this after 5 years, poor fella. It may well be that after the hesitations of 2024, we actually start to see some fairly rapid progress on agreements this spring, in principle at least. So what's on the table? Well, we know the EU are very keen on the youth mobility scheme. The UK concerns tend to centre on the Home Office and worries about immigration, but there's been talk for months now that the EU is willing to work on an agreement that can be sold politically in the UK. They're always very pragmatic, it's how they work. So we can expect something to be agreed on this. The Tory press are trying to weaponise it. The Times describes it as the most politically toxic issue, which is absolute bollocks. They also repeat the lie that both Starmer and Thomas-Symonds have ruled it out, which they never have. The reason the Tory press are trying to make a meal out of this is because they know it's what the EU see as their first step towards closer cooperation. Not one of the steps, specifically the first step. In other words, no agreement on this, and there won't be any agreement on anything substantial. The media know this, which is why they're focusing their bile on it in order to trip up Labour's attempts to get anything out of these talks. But because Labour are committed to a whole range of agreements, it also makes it easy for them to ignore the press and get on with it. The main prize Labour are after is a massive reduction in checks on goods being exported to the single market. Now, it won't reduce the need for documentation being clear. As long as we remain outside the single market, that will always be needed. It's really just about slowing down the number of checks needed. It would be a useful boost if we didn't have to waste so much time with lorries stuck in lorry parks. It's been noted that the EU only checks about 1% of imports from New Zealand. Similar sort of thing for Switzerland, so it's realistic. Obviously, this is where harmonisation of standards will have to come into it, but that will be made easier with the metrology bill currently passing through Parliament. Interestingly, although I didn't see it myself, so I was told that Yvette Cooper was asked about this bill in an interview yesterday, and she said she didn't know much about it. Now, it's not a Home Office bill. There's no reason for her to particularly know about it. It's a very technical piece of legislation, so she wasn't necessarily lying. But interesting that journalists wanted to ask about it, and she didn't really want to talk about it. Maybe because it's intended as the very quiet and boring way in which Labour do the opposite of what Jacob Rees-Mogg intended with his retained EU law bill. This allows ministers to align standards in lots of areas where it would be needed to ease trade friction, which is going to be an essential part of reducing those checks needed. So from what I can gather, there is real scope for an agreement here. Where the Brexit papers may start agitating would be fishing. It's likely that the EU want a better fishing deal when we review the Trading Cooperation Agreement next year. As I explained in a video recently, since Brexit, British fishermen are indeed landing more fish, but they're getting paid less. So I wonder if the government will work with the fishing industry, explain the current problems, which they're well aware of, and say to them, look, your major problem right now is the trade barriers. We can arrange for fewer checks. We can arrange for those trade barriers to come down, which will make it easier for you to sell. But in return, we will need to give better access to fishing waters, right? That's my speculation. I've not heard anything, but that would be the approach I would take. Should cut the feet out from under Farage when he starts talking about fishing again for the first time in half a decade. Ed Miliband apparently is quite keen on an energy deal, which could include joint procurement, as well as, of course, setting up joining our emissions trading schemes. That would be worth a bit. We know Labour are keen on a deal to allow performers to tour more easily. Wouldn't shift the economic dial at all, but some top performers have been very vocal about it, so it would be a good PR win. That being said, my interest, beyond the fact it will help some people out, is that despite the current red lines, it would represent a scheme which would smudge them. In fact, so we get a youth mobility scheme of some kind and the deal for touring performers, neither of which will strictly be freedom of movement, of course. So it won't go against any of Labour's manifesto promises, but they will bear some of the hallmarks. So I see them as a way of tiptoeing towards an understanding of the economic benefits which freedom of movement brings. And once you get to that point, the rest would follow like a cork out of a bottle. The freedom of movement issue is the big barrier to like major movement on lots of things. If you can detoxify that concept. And I'm not sure there are many reasons for most people to not want to go back into the single market at that point, because that seems to be the major block. And once you accept that we should be back in the single market, what reason is there to not be full members of the EU? There's also a good chance we'll get a deal for performers as well, because apparently the EU were quite happy to do that under the last Conservative government, but they sort of pulled back ahead of the election because they realised that Labour really wanted it, and they thought, oh, we'll use this as a bargaining chip. In the same way that Labour's trying to do the same thing with youth mobility. It's all just silly games for two schemes of obvious mutual benefit. Final big request for Labour is mutual recognition of qualifications. That is considered the trickiest because some EU cities benefited from migration of service jobs from London. In fact, of all the things Labour are after, as long as they're sensitive to what the EU want, we can get them, apart from maybe this one. But it would also be a really important one to push for. There's an expectation that we will once again share intelligence between police forces, something which Boris Johnson bafflingly pulled out of, even though it's massively in our interest, and the Conservatives were keen, broadly. Not quite sure why Johnson wanted to help out international money launderers and human traffickers. Maybe because a lot of them are Russian. But this should be an easy agreement to get. We want to share information for policing purposes. The EU want to share intelligence. And there are zero political frictions on either side. Even David Davis could negotiate that deal. Starmer will also want to talk about an EU-wide returns agreement, which apparently does have scope. Be politically sensitive for the EU, but youth mobility and better fishing access will be politically sensitive for Labour. So we're both just going to have to grit our teeth, accept there will be some agreement, which will mean having to fight a sort of PR war with the media. Nigel Farage and Kemi Badenoch will, of course, be waiting for that movement on fishing. But this is why I say Labour should work directly with the fishing industry, link enhanced access for EU fishermen with lower trade barriers for British fishermen, get the fishing industry on board, and Farage and Badenoch will be left floundering. And yes, that was a pun. So I think those are the main areas we can expect to see discussed over the next few months. I think those would be the ones that the summit would be framed around. We should know by summer what is and is not going to progress. So don't expect the same slow movement we had last year where it was very ooh. I think this is the year for getting things pinned down. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, please click the like button and subscribe for further content. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can click the join button for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.